Kevin Steele. Episode 78 of Grace and Steel is sponsored by Pepe Reads, an alt-right patriotic book club which will meet monthly in downtown Vancouver. Those interested in taking part are invited to contact the organizer at pepereads@protonmail.com. One of the most encouraging developments associated with the regeneration of the right has been the proliferation of websites which publish the work of new writers not associated with Conservatism Inc. One of the best of these sites is called the Z-Blog. Last week, my co-host Kevin Michael Grace interviewed the eponymous Z-Blogger about why he created his site, how he ascended up from conservatism, and why he lives in Baltimore, among other subjects.
Well, welcome, Z-Blogger, or as we in Canada say, Z-Blogger. Actually, that's not true. Most Canadians pronounce it with use the American pronunciation. But I am perverse in this way, or just a stickler. So I will call you the Z-Blogger.
I've been to Canada many, many times, and I enjoy making sport of Canadians for Z, especially French Canadians for their bad French, and of course the Mackenzie brothers, which were popular when I was a kid.
Yeah, the Mackenzie brothers. Well, that's SCTV, which is one of the high points of comedy. Hey, I wanted to say right from the start that I really think your blog is quite good.
Well, thank you.
And I only came across it for the first time about a couple of months ago. How long have you been doing it for?
I think, well, let's see. I have done my 10,000th post, so that's a lot of posts. But when I first started, I did the traditional blogger thing. I think that was like 2014, maybe something like that, end of 2014. And I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with it, so I started doing the link to a story, a news story, and cut and paste some stuff, and then put some snarky comments in there. And so I'd have 3 or 4 a day, but that got boring. So
we call that in the business a linker, not a thinker.
Yeah, honestly, it was an exercise. It really wasn't anything else. So
you can do that kind of stuff that you described. That stuff is best done on Twitter, actually.
Exactly. And I'm not really good with snarky comments I think, like Steve Saylor does a lot of that, and he's got a very dry sense of humor. And I think if you've read him for a long time, you know all his inside jokes, so it works really well. But, I'm not him. And so I didn't, and I thought it was boring. So I went to the essay model, and I like doing it. I like writing. Not really for an audience. I just like writing as it's kind of cathartic, I guess. So, it was fun. And so to my surprise, I've gotten popular, which I didn't expect.
You get a lot of comments on your posts.
I do. And I get a lot of emails.
Are they moderated, by the way?
Not at all. I let everything go through. I have a spam filter. Mostly, Ukrainian, Chinese stuff gets caught in there.
Sunglasses, cheap sunglasses.
Yeah, I made $9 million last week working from home, but otherwise, and it's unattended. I just use a service. And
well, what about? You're going to get all these Nazis showing up talking about the unappreciated genius of Hitler and such like, right?
You know what? I have had a few, and largely people just ignore them and they go away. That seems to be my hunch. Is a lot of those guys are just I suspect that some of them are provocateurs who are just trying to get people to say terrible things about Jews or blacks or whatever, and it actually has nothing at all to do with they're not really ideologues in that way. So when they don't find a fight, they move on to something else. But I think some of the hardcore guys, they've got places to go where they can stir up trouble. The Daily Stormer or the Right Stuff, and that works well for them.
So you're happy writing without payment?
Well, no, I'd like to get paid for everything I do. Being paid is great. But my understanding of the opinion business is that you either get a job holding the microphone for some rich guy, like the Wall Street Journal or Washington Post or something like that. And that's a long apprenticeship, so they make sure that you won't color outside the lines or say anything you're not supposed to say. And then you make a good living. Or you work for some small publication someplace and learn to live without food. Those are your two choices. And of course, there's a third choice, and that is a hobby. And that's what I'm doing. Although it's a funny thing. I get there's a sense of propriety, I think, in the people who read right-wing blogs and websites, in that they understand, by and large, that the mass media, the for-pay media, is all dominated by lefties. And they really want to support the alternatives. So I probably get at least one email a week asking me why I don't take PayPal or Bitcoin or contributions. At least one a week. And it's strange. People are almost offended that I don't have the little tip jar. So I've broken the 100,000 per month unique user reader. I have a bit of software that it filters out the spiders and crawlers and all the other stuff that's for advertising. And so it keeps track of your average, your per
So you
month.
have over 100,000 unique visitors a month.
Yeah, and it's been pretty steady. So when I was at 50,000, I said, well, if I ever get to 75,000, I'll consider going through the hoops of putting up a tip jar and all that goes with it. And then when that happened, I said, well, when I get to 100,000, and unfortunately people have remembered this, and now so I'm starting to get emails saying, look, you have to do this. It's only fair. So it's on my to-do list.
Well, it's interesting what's happened in journalism. It's not interesting so much as hideously depressing for people like me who were in journalism. To give you one example, opinion writing. A friend of mine was quite excited 15 years ago because he had a piece in the Dallas Morning News, which is one of the biggest circulation newspapers in America. And I asked him how much he got paid for it, and he said $150. Now, I happen to know that this was what the National Post in Canada was paying for its opinion pieces. Actually, that may have gone down, but 15 years ago it was $150. Now, the terrible thing is, if you wanted to go back 30 years before that, you were getting $150 in $1970.
Yep.
So there were a number of people who made a pretty good living freelancing editorial pieces. Well, that's gone. That's gone because everyone is a writer now. But it is fascinating to me that so many of the people who might be considered alt-right, they have regular jobs and they write as a hobby, and they are in no way dependent upon income or gifts related to their writing to survive. And I think that it definitely affects the tenor of their opinions. I mean, people write with considerably more freedom that way.
Yeah, that's a big piece of the puzzle, I think, because if I know someone who he used to work for some of the bigger print magazines like Time Magazine and Newsweek, and one of the things that it always shined through is just how narrow the ideological space was and how careful everyone had to be, and it was his greatest source of stress was that everyone's was because there were so few positions that paid reasonably well. Everyone was afraid of saying the wrong thing because once you were cast out into the outer darkness, you became a plumber or something, and you were an unperson. And
you see that happen in the United States. There was a concerted effort to destroy Pat Buchanan, and Pat Buchanan was, if you remember him back when he was on CNN, he pretty much had 2 shows on CNN. And his syndicated column and his books, and there was a concerted effort to destroy him, and it almost succeeded.
That was when people every once in a while will ask me, like, when did you start to turn on the official right, Conservative Inc. And I always say Pat Buchanan. That was a despicable, nasty thing, and the people behind it should never be forgiven. Bill Kristol, if we had any sense, Bill Kristol would be in hiding somewhere where no one would find him. And not just for that, but for a whole range of things. And no person has been more wrong about so much in such a catastrophic way. But and the warning sign should have been him going after Buchanan as some sort of virulent anti-Semite. That was disgusting, and it even to this day, all these years, it still pisses me off.
Well, no, you know the old Roman practice of proscription?
Yes.
Yes, I think that should be recovered.
Yeah, so one of my commenters actually said that he should be punished to having to roll Jonah Goldberg up a hill for eternity.
Yes, a Sisyphean punishment.
Well, that's one of the funny things about my blog is I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but the quality of comments are more often than not, the comments are better than what I post. There's some very smart people in positions of responsibility, university people, some government people. And, they know how I work. It's, anonymous, it's anonymous. I don't force them to sign up, and pledge their loyalties or identify themselves. And it's become, there's probably a dozen guys and gals that blow off a little steam in the comment section. And some of it is very, very good. I've had people on Twitter say that I see them, recommend my blog and say, but, don't comment because the commenters are really smart and, you probably, should be careful. Some are intimidated by the comments.
Well, it is very telling to contrast comments, say, on your blog or Steve Saylor's blogs or some others with the comments that appear on daily newspaper com boxes. Yes. I just see this stuff. You're a Nazi. No, you're a Nazi. No, you're a Nazi. Or, you're a Putin shill. No, you're a Putin shill. And I have stopped reading them almost entirely because when I do, I think it's time to enter one of those Cistercian monasteries, where you're not allowed to speak.
Yeah, there's a lot of red team, blue team hooting that still goes on, and I've long since grown tired of that. But the one area where comment sections and news reports are fun is in a crime story. I live in Baltimore, which is a pretty rugged town, and no one has any illusions about the nature of crime. And you'll see a crime story that says, well, the police are looking for a man with a red hat, or he's a tall man. And the comments are hilarious because they'll fill out all the details without knowing anything else about the man other than they didn't describe his race or what neighborhood he was from or give his name. And it's an amazing sort of a weird, almost esoteric language our crime reports have because the words are meaningless. You have to read between the lines to understand what the world they're trying to communicate.
Well, you read enough of these. The mainstream media stories have been written in code for decades. I used to read USA Today every day, and I used to be a big NFL fan. And I noticed there was this strange code when they were writing about black athletes, like Bo, right? And they would talk about their mothers and their mothers giving them a whooping and all this kind of stuff. And then I realized this was code for he's one of the good ones.
Yes. Yeah, it's a funny thing to me. I grew up in the South. I grew up around a lot of black people. I'm a minority in my neighborhood. I've always been comfortable around black people. And strangely enough, black people always like me. I think I have a friendly face or I have no explanation for it, but the fact is that blacks are much more race aware and race realist than whites by orders of magnitude. They're not afraid to say what they see, and they're not offended by it. And what's strange to me is that liberals, whites in America, they are so unaware of or so insulated from intellectually, spiritually, as well as physically in most cases, from the black experience, they really believe that they're doing black people a favor by using this strange pseudo-language to talk about issues, anything that relates to race.
Or they're telling the world that their imaginary best black friend is Jay-Z.
Yeah, it's the craziest thing. I had some people working in my home yesterday, and two black guys, and they were chit-chatting, and I fell into conversation with them. And of course, black people will always kind of see if you're okay. They do that with a white guy, particularly a middle-aged white man. And once they quickly ascertained that I was okay, they spoke freely. And we were joking about 1970s TV shows and how you couldn't put, Red Fox could not put his show on television today. He just wouldn't be allowed. And I think even most black people in America are really sick of this weird politically correct culture with regards to race. I think most, black people with jobs and responsibilities and all that stuff, they sense that this is terrible for them. But where do they go? You're going to go to Republican Party, you're going to go to Democrat. There's no place to go to voice your complaint. So, I'm not surprised that Trump did better with blacks than any other Republican.
Well, black males.
Yes.
He did atrociously badly with black females. I think 5% of the vote.
But that's probably a carryover from the Obama effect. I think it's interesting that Staler's always kind of had this right, is that Obama's strongest constituency was black females because they're often the ones going to the funerals for their sons or a friend of their sons. There's a real sexual divide in the black community that it's hard for people to sometimes, I think, appreciate. But I think, there are the black guys who are just losers. They're the hustlers. They're out on the street corner. They're looking for trouble. But then there's this cohort of responsible black males who get jobs, and they're increasingly resentful of the fact that there's no one who speaks to them at all.
What do you hear about the matriarchy?
Yeah, there's no question that, and I think that would never change. I think that there's something there that goes back a lot further than modern history. If you talk to people who grew up in Africa, there's a guy on my blog who is originally from Rhodesia, and he will tell you that it's in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a female-dominated society. There's a narrow role for males, but the domestic life, community life is largely dominated by females. And I think there's a biological component there that is just transcends anything we're going to do as a society.
Hey, so you live in Baltimore. Do you know James LaFond?
I know he's commented to me. I've read his blog from time to time. He definitely digs when I start talking about the ghetto, which I haven't done in a while. I feel as if I need to get back to that topic. Yeah, amazingly, of course, most people are wholly unaware of what an urban ghetto is like. We drive around them. We design roads around them. We built these urban reservations in parts of America.
Well, that scene in National Lampoon's Vacation where the Griswolds get lost in the ghetto in St. Louis?
Exactly.
I'm thinking, I don't think you'd see that scene in a movie today.
No, and I have been on the streets of Baltimore where, and I'll remember this time because I started laughing actually, and it was terrible because these people were upset. I think they were Australians. I'm not entirely sure about that, but they seemed to have an Aussie accent. And they were almost in tears because they kept making a wrong turn and ending up in the ghetto, and they were lost. They couldn't figure out how to get to the highway. And that's a funny thing about Baltimore is you can be on a block that's very nice, nice restaurants, real homes, people walking their dogs, and 2 blocks down are boarded up, burned out buildings, gangbangers with pit bulls. It's a strange thing, and the gangbangers kind of understand where the lines are, so they won't go in a nice neighborhood.
I was in Baltimore in 2002, and it was a very short trip. Basically, I went there to see Edgar Allan Poe's grave, and I went down to the tourist center at the Squidport there in Baltimore and asked for directions, and I started walking with my girlfriend, and I noticed the neighborhood was getting sketchier and sketchier. That is to say, there didn't seem to be, there there weren't very many signs of human habitation, or if there were people there, they were all hiding. And I was very grateful that the graveyard showed up fairly quickly. It's not that far of a walk from the Squidport. But sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a funny city in that you can, as a middle-aged white person, you can go into the hardest of hard-thumping neighborhoods and be completely safe because they know you're a civilian. They understand that if they do something to you, it's more trouble than it's worth, and you're not there to cause any problems. On the other hand, some of the less dodgy neighborhoods where some of the young guys are trying to make a name for themselves can be, but even though their families have jobs and their neighborhoods are reasonably decent, they can actually be more dangerous to, your garden variety honky walking down the street. You do really have to know kind of the pulse of the place. But I don't do this anymore, but I used to take friends who come in from out of town. I take them on the ghetto tour, and they just don't see this stuff. They don't know what it's like. And
haven't they seen The Wire?
They always say that. Oh, is it like The Wire? And I tell them, well, that's the glamorized version, but it's not entirely wrong. It's just what's happened in Baltimore is anyone with any sense, black or white, got out, went out to the suburbs. There's pockets of the city that are still nice. There's pockets of the city that are in between. But there's a big section that's largely been abandoned to civilization. It's no longer, part of civilization.
Well, something like about 15 years ago, and I believe I mentioned this to Jared Taylor when I interviewed him, but based on information collated by La Griffe de Lyon, that the average white IQ in Baltimore is 86.
That's a pretty obvious thing when you look at, say, like Highlandtown, East Baltimore. These were all the sons and daughters of former dock workers, steel workers, people who worked at the car plants and the subsidiary businesses. But they're the ones who never made it out, who didn't have the good sense to flee. It's a lot like, say, Lebanon right now. Every Lebanese person with anything approaching a 3-digit IQ got out of Lebanon.
Or they have a Canadian passport.
Yes. And I know a lot of Lebanese, and they all will tell you that, hey, the ones who had anything on the ball left. And what's left is not a whole heck of a lot. It's okay to visit, but you don't want to go there. And I think that's happened to Baltimore as well, is that the remnant that's been left behind, because it's true in the black community as well. There's almost a full standard deviation in IQ between blacks in the Baltimore City and blacks in the surrounding suburbs.
Yeah, 76 was the IQ for Baltimore blacks that La Griffe de Lyon came up with. And 76, we're approaching Jamaica or Haiti.
Yeah, we used to say 70 was borderline retarded.
That's right.
It's quite an amazing thing. And I've alluded to this a little bit. I did a post on feudalism. Kind of have a fascination with feudalism because I think there's a lot of things to learn about our current age from the feudal period. And one thing, there's, especially when you talk about blacks, the thing that I've always told people is that we didn't do black people a whole lot of favors by skimming off the talented 10% and isolating them from the black community, because it lowered the average IQ of the black community, in effect, but also it removed these restraints that used to exist prior to the civil rights movement, that the people at the top, the people running the black community, were actually black people, and they didn't want to get mugged, they didn't want to get robbed, and they were willing to work with the larger community to do what was necessary to control the worst elements in their own community, and even if they've been turning a blind eye to some terrible things, but life is compromised. But when those people were skimmed off and put out into the white suburbs and the college towns and all that stuff, you've lost this controlling element. It's like reverse colonialism. Instead of taking the natural resources, you took the people.
Well, we do that with Africa, too.
Yes,
it's exactly. Like Africa doesn't need any doctors or engineers. Let's bring them all to North America.
It's exactly that. And I think as a society, we're risking that as well. There's not a lot of the sons of the doctor marrying the school teacher's daughter or the shopkeeper's daughter.
There's terrible assortative mating.
Yes.
I'll throw this in as a side. I think that this is correlated to the vast increase in autism that we see?
That's an interesting subject. I haven't thought a lot about, but my hunch has always been is that we're just noticing something that was always there, maybe expanding a definition.
I mean, we're breeding people like dogs now. We're breeding, oh no, IQ, IQ, IQ. And what happens is, you reach a point with dogs where you're breeding for a certain thing, and then you just get monstrousness. Oh, total hip displacement, or their eyes roll around in their sockets, and all of the things they talk about with purebred dogs. And now we're doing that willingly, to ourselves.
Well, and there's a certain cultural isolation as well, and I've worked with a fair number of South Asians, and one of the things that always strikes me is the narrowness. And when you talk to them, you find out that this strict caste system, I think, to some degree, has a big role to play. They don't interact with each other across social lines beyond, other than at the telescope length. They might see one another, but they're not interacting with one another. And so there's a strangeness between each layer. And I suspect that there's a lot of that going on here. It certainly is part of what has destroyed mainstream journalism. And even though it's still an active concern, it's still, I think, circling the bowl. The whole fake news phenomenon, the number of people who are now no longer believe the things they see on CNN or Fox or Washington Post is astronomical. People are just aware of the fact that most of it's made up, or at least colored in such a way that it may as well be made up. But the reason is...
if you look at the whole Williamsburg thing, everyone wants to live in Brooklyn now, right? And it's funny that when I read some opinion piece by some person who I think, this is intolerable, and then I look down at the little potted bio, so-and-so lives in Brooklyn, and I always say, well, of course he does. But no, sorry to interrupt. I was going to say that if you look at these people, the elite, or the aspirational people who intend to become members of the elite, and so what's the experience, your personal experience? What's the experience of your family or your extended family? Any of them on welfare? Any of them ever been in prison? Any of them ever been at risk, as so many Americans are, of losing their house or their apartment or being out on the street? And it's like you don't have any of these experiences, and you don't seem to be interested in them, even at secondhand.
That's absolutely true. And if you think, in 1950, the average newspaper man was living next to a plumber, maybe some dock workers in his neighborhood. His kids went to school with guys who were laborers. This was a blue-collar profession, in effect. If your kid was good with his letters, he could get an indoor job working as a journalist right out of high school. But of course, they didn't call them journalists; they called them reporters. But this was a person who was grounded in reality. Now, a Washington Post writer is living in Bethesda. Their husband has a six-figure job in the bureaucracy somewhere, or maybe at a think tank.
Or is a PR spiv.
Yes. The incest that goes on in Washington is astonishing. And most Americans are not aware of just how closed that loop is down there. I work in Washington a fair bit, and for instance, you can go online, you can find out where Lois Lerner, the crook from the IRS, who nothing ever happened to, she lives in a house, I think it's $1.3 million in Bethesda. Her final salary, I think, was something like $127,000 at the IRS per year. A little bit of math says, well, how does she afford a $1.3 million house? Well, her husband's got some job in the bureaucracy as well. He's making six figures. And, she's been bouncing around in political circles for her entire life. And that's what it is. It's a world of nothing but self-dealing.
But now these people, look, Hillary Clinton's a good example of this. These people are bribed on the way in, and they're bribed on the way out.
That's the good thing about a crook, is that when you know that they have a price, and it's fairly easy to establish what the price is. So, that always made me laugh about Hillary Clinton, is that people talking. She actually tried to run on integrity, which was astonishing. But if you were the Russians, if you were Putin, you really wanted her to win because you knew she had a price that was probably going to be fairly low.
Yeah, I don't know about that because apparently the Clintons are worth between $300 to $400 million. But hey, let me ask you something about Baltimore that has mystified me for some time. Apparently, they have these gangs, these black youth gangs that ride around on, what are they, BMX bicycles, or are they scooters or something like this? And
The 12 o'clockers.
they swarm a place and they cause all this havoc, and then they can get away and across open ground before the cops show up. Or I think I read something that the city administration and the police have pretty much taken a hands-off attitude towards these people.
Well, there's a long tradition. They called them, I think, 12 o'clockers. They could ride a scooter or a bike and pull the front wheel up so they were almost at 12 o'clock. And, kids doing tricks. And inevitably, now, they did ban certain kinds of scooters in the city because they were using them to go down the alleys and get away from the police. But since where the cops are chasing these guys now, the alleys are all full of junk anyway, it kind of became a moot point. But there's a fair amount of benign neglect in the ghetto. If you were driving, assuming that you're a garden variety, a typical white person, and you're driving into a bad part of the city, there's a good chance a cop will stop you, be polite, and make sure you don't continue on, that you turn around and go back to where you belong. And the reverse happens as well. It's not Amsterdam like you saw in The Wire,
right,
but it's not that far away. A similar thing used to happen in Washington. In Washington, you could walk away from the mall and go a couple of blocks, and you'd see 2 squad cars sitting on the corner. And if you walk too far, they would get out of their car and tell you you have to go back. It's just a reality of a city with a population like Baltimore or Washington or even Philadelphia, which is gentrifying a bit. Certainly New York, it's, let's face it, stop and frisk was a big sign hanging up in Manhattan that said, black people are not welcome. I mean, that's really what it was. I mean, or a certain type of black person, you're not welcome. Young black males with your pants hanging down, don't come into Manhattan.
Well, this is grossly unconstitutional, but we got to do this or else the rich people will start leaving, and we can't have that.
Exactly. One of the things I always tell people about being a conservative, they're shocked sometimes when I'll say I'm perfectly fine with that. The first rule is we want a civilized society. We want to be able to walk around on our streets without being accosted, by criminals. We don't want banditry. So you make compromises. That's the mature way of looking at it. Yes, it would be nice if we could live in a world of high IQ libertarians, but until we all flee to Australia and create libertarian paradise, that's not going to happen. So there's always compromises.
Well, let me ask you this. I've displayed my irritation with the constitutionalists many times. But within the last couple of months, we've had the Vault 7 release from WikiLeaks. And it is now pretty obvious that Trump was surveilled, however you want to describe it. Jim Kunstler talked about this legalistic pettifogging. Oh, no, he wasn't wiretapped. Oh, no, they were spying on him, right? My point in bringing this up is that, hey, how come the constitutionalists aren't wailing that America seems to have become a national security state? Where are all these tireless champions of the Constitution demanding action on this? And oh, by the way, Trump's intervention in Syria is, illegal. And where are the constitutionalists on this? What's your view?
Well, I always point out to people for a while. Recently, I've had other issues, but if your Constitution, if the 9 priests who read interpreted the strange marks on the parchment and came back and said, yes, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were absolutely sure that 2 men should be allowed to get married and we're all required to pretend that they're husband and wife. Well, that's crazy. I mean, I'm sorry, but the Constitution's been dead for a long time. So stop talking to me about a piece of paper that was a collection of aspirations written by men who died 300 years ago. It no longer applies, and we just need to accept that. It just does not apply. We'll get a new Constitution when we get a new government. We get a new government after a bloody revolution. That's how it works. That's the way it's always worked. Unless you're the French who went through, I don't know, how many constitutions are they up to now? But
well, they've had 5 republics.
Yeah, I mean, and even in, we think what have in the French Revolution and the 10 years or 15 years to Napoleon was what, 4 or 5 constitutions.
Well,
So
you want to get it right, you know?
yeah, a constitution is a set of solutions to the problems you've already solved. That's really what it is, and the Constitution as written was exactly that, and we have new problems now, and I think. That doesn't mean I'm against the constitutional principles, or I think that what's in the Constitution. Do I think we would be a much better country if we rolled back all the amendments and got back to the original document? Sure, we would be. That's not going to happen.
Well, no, I mean, Joe Sobran used to say all the time that obviously, by any reasonable interpretation of the Constitution, all of this quasi-governmental bureaucracy that came out of FDR and afterwards is unconstitutional, but everyone seems to be okay with that.
Yeah, exactly, and it's kind of like the certain type of Christian who will stand up there and wave his Bible around. It's all circumstantial and when it's convenient, because unless you are a complete lunatic, you understand that there are no perfect set of rules that apply in all cases and all times. Life is nothing but compromise, and we bugger through, we muddle through. What we best we can hope for, I think, is a general way of buggering through, and where things have gone completely haywire in America is that the progressives, the neo-Puritans of our age, they're gripped by this universalism that they think that in all places and all times that they can create a set of rules that always work. And I was kind of hoping that the complete disaster of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Egypt, Syria, I'm missing some, I'm sure, has finally maybe started to settle in on these people that, not everybody's the same after all. And maybe this, one size fits all isn't such a great idea. You started hearing noises from Democrats after the election to that effect, that maybe we need to restore state power back to the states. They haven't said that recently, but if one of my moments of optimism, I start to think that if we really screw up bad enough, maybe people will drop the universalism.
Well, there's a well-known editorial writer in Canada named Andrew Coyne, who is often called the leading conservative writer or leading right-wing writer in Canada. He's actually a radical autonomist, a libertarian spurg. I have it on very good authority that he went on a trip to Europe in the 1990s, and he visited France and Italy. And after he returned, he expressed with considerable astonishment to his colleague that the French and Italians are very different from us.
Yeah, it really is an amazing thing in a way. I've noticed in America, one of the things that is always true, or always was true in my lifetime, that people who are running around championing diversity and multiculturalism have the least amount of exposure to it. It's astonishing to me. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was a young man, I left. I grew up in Virginia, and I went away to high school when I was 14, and I decided that instead of going home, I'm going to go to college. So I went up to Boston to go to college, and I didn't have any money, and so I had to work, a million different jobs. And the first place I worked was this warehouse, and the person running the place detected a bit of a Southern accent, I guess, and he knew I was from south of Connecticut, which made me a Southerner as far as he was concerned. And the two things that jumped out at me, I think he was sure that I had grown up on a plantation. That's how little he knew about the South. Well, the other thing he said to me, and he lowered his tone, and he said, well, if you're going to work in a warehouse, you need to be aware of the fact that we have black people and we have Spanish people. And I was just a young guy, but, as I was increasingly streetwise, I realized that he meant it, that he was serious, and he had no idea that what the rest of the world was like, because Boston's a very lily-white city. And so I looked at him and I said, well, I think I can make it work. I speak a little Spanish. You would have thought I said to him that I came from another planet. He was astonished that I knew some Spanish.
Well, I would have been tempted to say, we have black and we have Spanish people working here, and say, yeah, well, I'm going to need someone to fetch me my mint juleps.
Yeah, it was astonishing, and but what I learned is that Steve Saylor brings this up a lot. That's Moynihan's rule of the Canadian border.
Right.
And it applies to a lot of things. The further north you go, like I was in Iceland last summer, and the people in Iceland celebrate diversity with an enthusiasm of a lunatic. It's amazing, but they don't have any diversity. So they want the thing that they don't have. And yet, if you go to Miami, no one talks about diversity. It's silly. Further away you get from the great white north, the more people are realistic about human biodiversity.
Well, Toronto and Vancouver are now majority non-white, and you hear an awful lot of talk about diversity still in those places. It seems to me that diversity essentially means now no white people.
Well, that's true. It's a funny thing because that actually started happening in the black community. The word diversity, probably in the 90s, black people would use the word diversity to mean no whites. It's a diverse place. There's no white people. And it didn't always mean that as a good thing. One of the strange things that white liberals never seem to understand is that black people don't want to get too far away from white people. I joke that I'm the canary in a coal mine in my neighborhood. When I move away, all the sensible black people are going to follow me.
Well, this is the undertow that Paul Kersey writes about.
Yeah, I think it's probably not really thought about too much. I've never had a conversation with anyone about it, but I've had conversations with my neighbors, black and Hispanic. We have a decent number of Hispanics. I have a surprising number of South Asians, which is really interesting. South Asians are outlandishly racist. And they're just shameless about it. In a way, it's almost endearing because you can tell they just don't really seem to they don't understand the rules. And so even like the black guys will just laugh about it. What can you say? They're not being mean. They're just unknowing. But you talk to people around the neighborhood who are reasonably responsible, they're always worried about, and it's almost unsaid, when they start seeing the good people leave, it's time to get out.
So let me ask you about the educational function of your blog. Well, why don't you explain that to our listeners? Talk about it a little and why you started doing it.
Oh, you mean the essential knowledge posts?
That's right.
Yeah. There's a German guy who comments a lot, and he's an interesting guy. He can give it as well as take it, and he's very patriotic in the sense of sort of the German blood and soil patriotism. And even though he doesn't live in Germany, I think he lives in Switzerland. But he's proud about various German solutions to social problems, healthcare, and that sort of thing. And he gets in these fights back and forth. He's highly literate, and he's well read, and he's got he got me engaged in a conversation about books. And he said we should do a blog on books you would recommend on various subjects. And I thought, that's a pretty good idea. I might do that. So I started thinking about it. I thought, well, you know what? You can just make a list of books. Anybody can do that. The listicle is the worst form of writing. It actually falls below grocery list, to-do list. I hate listicles. So I thought, I can't do that. I would make me not just a hypocrite, but I'd hate myself for doing it. So I started rethinking it, and I thought, well, what is it you really need to know if you're reading my blog, what are things that you should, that I would reference, and assuming that you would know, and that's kind of where I started off on. And you remember, I'm guessing you're probably, I'm 50. Are you older than me, younger than me?
Yeah, I'm 62 in a couple of months.
Well, then you remember the urge for the great books education. We're going to have this core.
Mortimer Adler.
Yes. And that's kind of what I had in mind, is that, here's this foundation of Western civilization. Here's this core of knowledge. And that's kind of the center of the Christmas tree. We hang all this other stuff off of it, but that's the center. And that's kind of where I've started doing this. And what's fun about it, this is all stuff I like reading about. So, and I've got some strange tastes. So it works out pretty well. I'm probably I may be the only person I know who really likes reading about the 100 Years' War or the 30 Years' War, which I think the 30 Years' War is one of the most fascinating periods in Western history.
Oh, well, catastrophic as well.
Yes. Parts of Central Europe were reduced to cannibalism. I mean, think about that. That's quite remarkable. And it's also, I think, a useful thing to think about when looking at what's going on in the Middle East and our role in there. To some degree, we're playing the role of France in their 30 Years' War. Because it's a sectarian war that's going on there. It's at times low grade, but it's still a religious war. Well, anyway, back to your question. So I started doing these posts, and people, I didn't get a lot of comments on them, but the comments I get were, "Oh, this is great. I copied this off and I gave it to, my sister or my brother-in-law." And I just, it kind of occurred to me that, geez, there's, lots of people like me. I know there's lots and lots of people like me who still read books, who are still curious, who still use the internet for what people imagined it for, is the Library of Alexandria. The sum total of human knowledge is at our fingertips. But it helps that somebody who has an interest in subject A says, "Hey, here's the sources that you should use." So it's like a public service, and it's fun to write them too.
Well, I have to commend you for this because it's needed. I've talked to Peter Brimelow about this, and we talked about the right in America before Reagan was elected. And for a little while afterward, this was a high IQ society. It has become progressively lower and lower IQ, and it strikes me distinctly anti-intellectual.
I would agree with that.
You can't have opinions without knowledge. Well, you can, but it's not a good idea.
It's a funny thing. I mean, I grew up very poor, and the classic, broken home, poverty, you name it. I grew up in a home without heat and, like a furnace. We had a wood stove. And everyone was literate. My grandfather didn't have any formal education at all. Not only did he teach himself English, and he spoke perfect English, he taught himself calculus. We had a library that was within walking distance. It was, they were all over the place. And I think if you study World War I, and I imagine, like Canada played a big role in World War I, right? You have a lot of Canadian soldiers fought because of.
We took a astonishing number of casualties and deaths.
Yeah,
proportionate to our size.
And what I would imagine when they do stories on the Great War in Canada, they rely heavily on soldiers writing letters home and how well they're written. These were poor people, often without formal education beyond maybe, middle school today, maybe a little high school. But they were literate. They could write, and they could express themselves in the written word. I have a tough time understanding writing for most college graduates today because it's almost nonsensical.
Well, Albert J. Nock once asked the question, how do we know if we're entering a dark age? I thought about this a lot in recent years, and, one of the ways you'd know you were entering a dark age is that it was a commonplace for my generation, and I suppose the generation that followed that beginning in grade 1, if the students didn't know how to read, by Christmas everyone knew how to read. Now it is routine and a big problem that all this money is being thrown at, that we have students in grade 3 and beyond who don't learn to read, and since they teach reading using the look-say method, will never actually learn to read. And we seem to be pretty calm about this.
Part of what the blog, what motivated me to do it, was that I've always had the habit, since I was a child, of writing things out. If I didn't understand something, I would try and write it out, explain it in writing. And I would end up with pages and pages of crossed out stuff. But it helped me work through understanding something I didn't understand.
Oh, and somebody famous said, I wish I could remember the name, said, I never know what I think about something until I write about it.
Exactly. It's a good way it forces you to organize your thoughts and see how connected each thought is. And I find it the most obvious way to learn things. And it's the old argument that the guys who wrote with quill pens, the ink reservoir, they had to think very carefully before they put pen to paper. So they tended to be a different type of writer than when we have a word processor in front of us that allows us to fix mistakes and go back and cut and paste and all the other things.
On the other hand, you have these 18th century English novelists with their tomes, their hundreds, Tom Jones and books like that, which are interminable.
Yeah, it's funny. It used to be, you're not allowed to say these things, but that one of the good things about the modern age is that you can say, I think I heard John Derbyshire say that he doesn't like Shakespeare. That he's never really cared for Shakespeare. When I was a kid, you were advertising your ignorance by saying you didn't like anything that was considered part of the canon. I think that's one of the few good things about our anti-intellectualism of the day is that you can get away with saying, well, I didn't really, I didn't care for Tolstoy.
Have you seen Lord Clark's documentary Civilization?
I have not.
Well, I've seen it for the first time just recently, and I was rather shocked that he devotes a fair amount of time to talking about Shakespeare and dramatizes some of it. And he claims that Shakespeare was a nihilist, a man without religion, without any religion, he said.
You know what? I could believe that. My hunch with the English is that they were never particularly religious people. The Saudis take their very religious sons and send them off to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and hoping that they'll never come back. I think the English eventually figured out how to pack off the Puritans and send them to America, primarily because they were just sick of the religious fanatics. It's always been my hunch about. I guess because every English person I've ever met has always been kind of less than a true believer. I think a little skeptical of organized religion.
Well, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, as they call it it's a very English God,
Yeah, and of course today it's a very liberal, progressive religion.
It reflects what England has become, which is to overwork a cliche, a dystopian nightmare. I mean, you must have heard the stories. This Alexander Chancellor, who used to edit The Spectator, he said that he'd noticed this, and that if you are looking somewhere, like at some fixed point, you're thinking about something, and you realize you've made eye contact with someone, one of these younger fellows with a shaved head, right? And then what you get from him is, oi, mate, you got a problem, mate? And it's like this menace everywhere, right?
Well, living in the ghetto, that's called Tuesday.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably all relative. We have here in Baltimore, I think it's 36 murders per 100,000, something like that. You get accustomed to crime, and I think the English, which is their murder rate is like 2, I think, something like that. It's all relative. I think you guys.
No, but
Canada,
it depends. I mean, there are large parts of England. I would just back of the envelope say about 50% of England as much as it ever was, because there's no diversity.
Yes.
When you move into the diverse areas, then the murder rate and violent crime rate skyrockets. And as Peter Hitchens has demonstrated again and again, the police don't even bother to record these statistics any longer.
Yeah, that's definitely a true thing here. We have a problem in Baltimore where the bodies just get thrown into the boarded up buildings and no one looks for them. So I'm sure there's a part of that. It's interesting. When I was in Dublin last summer, and I don't know, this is apropos of nothing, but I just thought of it. I was chit-chatting with the locals and at pubs, and I would tell them I was from Baltimore. And of course, they had seen The Wire. And the reaction was like Clint Eastwood had just walked into the their assumption was I must be this hyper-violent, fellow who you just don't want to upset him. It was a very strange experience, but it's, how if you try to experience a country through its television shows, you're going to get a very warped perspective, I think.
No, that's absolutely true. And it's my belief this is one of the serious problems that Britain has had, is they have a very distorted view of America. Their view of America is that everyone gets to do what he wants to do, and there's no class system, and it's like, fuck you, I'm doing what I want. The other side of America, of people starting their businesses and working and investing and all that, they don't know about that. It's like their idea of America is it's a place where everyone eats KFC out of the bucket and then, throws the bones onto the street.
Yeah, it's the size of our country. So, Canada's got this problem as well. Most people, when they think outside of North America, they think of Canada, they think Well, they think hockey, they'll think Toronto, they'll think Montreal, maybe. And you're in BC, right?
I'm in Victoria,
Okay.
BC.
Most Americans, you may as well be on the moon. They're simply unaware of the fact that Canada has a western half of its country. But Canada's a huge country. If you want to drive from one side to the other, it's going to take you a long time. You can, it's a day trip to drive from one end of England to the other. And that size means something. And, that it gives you, it's diversity, a different kind of diversity. It's one of the things that people on the right have is an appreciation for diversity. And you've brought it up, and I'm bringing it up now. But, Vancouver is a different place than Moose Jaw, and Western Canada is a different place than Toronto, or certainly different than Quebec. Canada is not one unified blood and soil place. It's a whole bunch of different tribes kind of stuck together.
Well, yeah, but we see a similar thing in Canada as we see in the United States, that this regionalism is largely disappearing because of globalism and, because of diversity. The more diversity we get, the more mono our culture becomes. It's the same, increasingly the same everywhere, with the same group of people, the same stores, people listening to the same music, wearing the same clothes.
Well, that's the curse of financialization. We've moved in the 1980s, when Reagan signed off on the Louvre Accords. We moved from what we think of as a fiat currency to really a credit money. And credit money is corrosive in ways that people don't appreciate. The example I like to use is industrial supplies, plumbing, welding supplies, things like that. Throughout America, you'd see these little mom and pop operations, this little warehouse, wife is in the back doing the books, husband's running the front, making sure that the trucks go out for delivery, that sort of thing. There were small businesses that their value added was location. They were nearby. So when you were doing construction work, you went to that place and you bought their stuff. And then what happened, some rich guys from Wall Street with credit money said, well, hey, we're going to find one of the successful ones. We'll invest in him and help him buy up all his competitors. And we can get rid of all the moms in the back doing the books and all the dads running the docks, and we'll hire some guys who are just, managers. And we'll strip out, we'll use it, to use the term, we'll strip out the usable assets and cash. And what's left is not anything cheap for the end customer. It's not like they're getting a bargain out of this relationship. It's the same store and the same products, but there's just fewer people employed in it, and the value of it has been siphoned off to New York City or wherever. And of course, that also results in all businesses being the same. Before long, it's all the Philadelphia industrial supply stores, which is pretty much the case now. Electrical supply stores are all owned by a handful of financial firms. They standardize everything across the board, so everything is the same. So the weird quirkiness of Pittsburgh is no longer exists because it's just been, eliminated and replaced by the weird quirkiness of the Wall Street firm that has financed this operation.
Well, you see this managerialism, and what we call scale. You see this at play with this United Airlines fiasco. That from the start, they made a U-turn, but they were looking at this as managerialists would, and they have become so spurgy that the idea that their business was, in this over the space of 24 hours, a large part or the greater part of the goodwill associated with United Airlines disappeared not only because of the incident itself, but of management's reaction to the reactions to the incident. I mean, this is, there doesn't seem to be any kind of personal connection anymore between businessmen and their companies.
Exactly. It's, where everyone is just literally a cog in a machine. Even the guy who's the CEO has no relationship to his own employees. They're just numbers on a page. And, it's been a problem. I saw this actually firsthand when I was a young guy, just starting out. I was quick to learn computer software, and I started out using VisiCalc, and then I learned how to use Lotus 1-2-3, which was the hot spreadsheet software. And as a result, I wound up working in the finance department of a national company, and I sat in all these meetings with the big shot managers. I was this young kid, and only because I knew how to work the machinery. And they would sit there and they didn't know who their employees were. They would look at an employee register that had no names, just social security numbers, salaries, name of the position, and draw red lines through them. And then they'd hand a report out to somebody else whose job it was to fire these people. And I remember looking at this thinking, how in the world can you expect any loyalty of your employees when they're just a red line on a green bar report? And of course, they didn't think about it, and no one does. But that's not a society. That's a transactional relationship. And then that's really where we're headed. If you look in America, we're highly transactional. There's no loyalty.
But we seem to be seeking transactionality in the sense that I had a conversation with someone recently about this and saying that, human beings are designed to need the company of other people. Otherwise, they go insane. But no, do you know that Amazon is going to, what is Amazon going to make our beds next? That a drone is going to come in and clean up your apartment and make your bed. And thus you won't have to have anything to do with any other people that you haven't chosen to have dealings with. And those people are chosen on the basis that their opinions and their interests are exactly the same as yours.
Well, it goes back to, I think this is probably the chief complaint of everyone on the right, or however you want to define the right. And that is, are we just this blank slate? Are we just this amorphous blob that can be made into anything under the right set of stimuli, right set of incentives? Or are we something else? Or are we, something more organic? And, we're marching towards this society based on the Brave New World. A book that was supposed to be a criticism is now being used as a handbook. But, the idea that we're all just going to be these moist robots that can be reprogrammed if we don't quite fit, it strikes me as an impossibility. But the question, of course, is that where does it end and how does it end? You brought up Amazon. It's a really good example of a company. When you start to examine them, you think, how is it that this company still exists? They don't exist as a traditional company. They start into a business, they get into it, they dominate it, but they never make a profit at it. So then they move into the next business and on it goes. What happens when they run out of new places to go? This whole drone stuff just seems like a marketing ploy to me.
That's what happened to Rome.
Yeah, exactly. It has that feel. It's the snake eating its tail here. I've been kind of toying around with this idea. I've been thinking about writing a book. And one idea I've had about it was, our current structure is like a bust out. Like the mafia. If you started betting with the mafia, you were the hardware store owner, and you got in over your head, they would come in and use up all your credit lines.
Oh yeah, they show this. They show this in Goodfellas with the Polynesian bar.
Exactly, and it almost feels as if that's going on now. That we have this almost a class of locusts who are just feeding on the middle class, consuming every bit of extra, and then once it's all squeezed dry, they're going to light a match and set a fire to the country. But where they plan to go after that is the puzzle.
Apparently, New Zealand, from what I hear.
Yeah, do you read Marginal Revolution?
No, not really.
Well,
is that Tyler Cowen?
Yes, it is.
He is the Spurg. He is so bonkers that I don't know. I mean, he's sort of a platonic ideal of the economist.
Yeah, I think I called him a gold-plated phony is what, and that's a terrible thing to say about someone, but I say it a lot. He's in a lot of ways a quintessential example of what went wrong with conservatism. If you remember a few years back, he was the toast of the town for the National Review crowd. Oh, they loved him.
Consider the fact that he and the whole Virginia school are headquartered in a university named after George Mason.
Yes. Well, and it's one of my favorite things to point out is that all of our top libertarians live off the state.
Well, yes, of course. Their experience with free enterprise is entirely notional.
It's truly amazing. It's almost as if the further you get away from actually having to earn a living, the more interested you are in libertarian economics.
No, I feel like there's like a binary division. You can ask people, how many times have you been fired or laid off in your life? What, never? This has never happened to you? I don't know whether you have much to contribute to this conversation then.
I got hired 15 years ago by someone, maybe even longer. His first question, he was a pugnacious fellow. And, he was a, executive VP, senior VP. And his first question to me was, have you ever gotten in a fight? I said, what do you mean? He says, you ever gotten into a fight? I said, well, sure. I've gotten lots of fights when I was a younger man. He said, well, tell me about one. So, very well. This is going to be weird. I might as well just enjoy it. So I started telling stories, and he told some stories about, a young man, he was a little bit of a troublemaker. And so I thought, okay, it's strange, but why not? And then he asked me about
being fired. And that man's name was Pat Buchanan, and now you know the rest of the story.
Well, then he asked me about, the time I got fired. I told him about it. And he said, do you think you deserved it? I said, yeah, I did deserve it. He said, did you learn anything for it? I said, yeah, don't get fired again. Being fired is terrible. And, we joked about it. But later on, what he said is he would never hire anyone. He would never hire a man who never got in a fight. And he would never hire anyone who never got fired. And it's always stuck with me is that, it's probably pretty good advice, that if you've never gotten punched in the nose, or have had to face some off against someone who wanted to, strangle you, there's a blindness to life that is probably going to be a problem at some point. I don't know. I mean, there was a guy named Nick. No, let's see. I think Nick, maybe Nick Pell. I mean, I could be wrong about this. But Nick Pell is an American guy who lives in Ireland. He does some alt-right stuff.
Oh, he's the one who caused that furor with his taxonomy or the listing of alt-right terms that appeared in the Irish Times, and everyone there went nuts.
Yes, that's him. I'm pretty sure he wrote a piece one time. Is that never trust a man who's never got punched in the face? I think that he wrote that. But yeah, he's an interesting guy. He kind of disappeared. I haven't seen him turning up anywhere. But I saw his interview with some Irish TV show, and he's an interesting guy. The alt-right.
Nick
and I'm not
Pell.
Sure he's
his name is Nick Pell.
I'm not sure.
No, I'm looking it up now. Yeah, Nick, the alt-right movement, everything you need to know. Nick Pell, January 2017.
And it was a great piece.
Yeah.
If you were a liberal or something, it would give you a real clear understanding of, or pretty good understanding. But the collection of personalities on the alt-right is the strongest thing they've got going for them. And I, it's funny. People ask me if I'm on the alt-right. I don't really think so, but I don't know, maybe. But the collection of personalities. It's important. Gavin McInnes is alt-light, I guess, and that Proud Boys stuff is stupid. But he's an entertaining guy, and that helps. That gets people interested in alternative ideas when the person who's talking about them is fun and interesting and strange. And
I think you're right about that, because the alternative is what's happened to National Review. I guess the Asians got bored with them. They're what was it? Sam Francis made the joke, and we'll have to ask what the Indian at National Review, who's been here for 2 weeks, has to tell us about conservatism. But now at National Review, it's all, it seems to be all Brits who, if they had stayed in England, would have been regularly depantsed and thrown in the college fountain.
Yeah, I tell you, I used to post in their comment section. It used to entertain the heck out of me because it's so easy to pull the threads out of these arguments. And so I'm, I guess, a bit of a troublemaker. And I used to like going on there and tormenting Kevin Williamson.
Ming the Merciless, as I call him.
Yeah, I mean, the guy is a complete and total gold-plated phony. I mean, that Quill Pen Act did not fool me for a second. The first time I read him, I spotted him as... Because, I'm old enough to remember George Will. George Will stole his act from Bill Buckley. Not exactly, of course, he gussied it up, but Bill Buckley was going to be let's face it, Bill Buckley was a phony also. His over-the-top Brahmin routine was never on the level. But there was a reason behind it. It was tolerable because he used it to inoculate himself against the charge of being a dummy. That extreme erudition, kept liberals from dismissing him as, an uneducated rube. So it was justifiable to that degree. But George Will, he borrowed a little bit from Bill Sapphire and borrowed a little bit from Bill Buckley and created the bow-tied bum kisser routine that he worked for Lord knows how long.
No, but this idea that, I used to be a professor, and I have a PhD from the University of Toronto. It's like, he's so smart. So, yeah, okay, but one of the arguments that you're making, I mean, the fact that you have a PhD and you have read a lot of books does not mean that you can't be criticized. Oh, no, the great George Will. And I'm thinking, this guy, he's been around for almost 50 years. And
Yes.
Has he ever said anything interesting? I mean, I read his book on baseball, and it infuriated me because he had the gall to criticize Ted Williams for not swinging at bad pitches.
Well, what math nerds like me recognize when we read, it's funny you read it. As soon as you started talking and you said his baseball book, I had to laugh because I remember reading that as well. And I thinking, this is a man who is unfamiliar with mathematics. And, I have a bias in that regard. And that is, we were talking before about my essential knowledge posts. And I've been holding off doing one on math because I do feel some sympathy for people who don't have an aptitude for mathematics. And I don't think you can, you're condemned to a life of ignorance if you are unable to master, advanced mathematics. But you have to appreciate the fact that the world is numbers. We don't always understand the relations of the numbers, but those numbers are there. And when a guy like George Will starts, criticizing the numbers guys, the guys who know
the sabermetricians.
Yeah, he's revealing things about himself that he'd be better off concealing. And it's kind of like when Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a book about baseball, about how, her love of baseball, and it was completely full of nonsense. She was better off not writing it. She should have just let that dog lie. But
hey, I got to say about Kevin Williamson that I see in him the same thing I see in P.J. O'Rourke, although O'Rourke has been amusing in the past and Williamson has not. But they have a problem with shame, of familial shame. That Williamson seems to be psychically crippled by the fact that he grew up in Amarillo, Texas, in the same way that P.J. O'Rourke is psychically crippled by the fact that he grew up in Toledo, Ohio.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I didn't know that about P.J. O'Rourke, who I've always kind of felt, honestly, a bit of a cornball, but harmless cornball. But although he's gone completely full anti-Trump nutter, so I don't know, maybe there's more to it with him. His heyday was really before I was around. I mean, he was really big, in the 70s, I think, right?
Well, no, it was in the 80s. In the mid-80s, he published a bunch of books, which were really quite amusing. And previously, he'd written for National Lampoon and had written a lot of good stuff there.
Well, I read Parliament of Whores, which I thought was actually pretty good. Even without the humor, it was actually very well done. And I recommend it to people because when I was in high school, I worked for a congressman. And his observations are spot on about how official Washington works. It's nothing like what people imagine it is. And his book I thought was a very good description. But let's get back to Kevin Williamson because I like making fun of him. What bugs me about him is that it's the faux intellectualism. You were talking before about being anti-intellectual, but there's a genuine interest and acquisition of knowledge, a sort of a humility that I think educated people bring to every subject. They recognize the fact that no man can know everything. And so there's this little pool of knowledge that you've acquired, and around it is this vast ocean of things that you learned about. And so, that's the fun of it. That's the fun of learning. And, it's what's wonderful about the internet. If I have a couple hours to kill waiting for my doctor, I can pull out my tablet and read about something. There's always something to learn. But there's this faux intellectualism where it's closed-minded. It's this, I've learned everything because I spent an hour reading the von Mises website. I now know everything about economics. Because I watched, a special on, and I watched the series Justified. I'm now an expert on Appalachia and poor white people. That makes me crazy because it's.
No, as I say, I mentioned this shame. That his hostility when he got into it with Michael Dougherty, it just this hatred which seems to be dripping off him against his own people.
Yes.
I say his own, but I grew up in the lower middle class, and those are my people. And I would have preferred not to have grown up in the lower middle class, but that's where I grew up, and those are the people that I know best.
Yeah, you imprint on your early teenage years. You sort of imprint on the society in which you're in at that time, I think, and that's certainly me. I live in a downscale neighborhoods. I always tend to, even though I could certainly afford not to. It's just it's what I know, and to some degree, it reminds me to be a little bit of proud of where you came from. And I say proud, I mean, you never want to outgrow your hat. So everybody has their reasons for these things, but there's a comfort level with it, and I think you're right about that hostility. But I've also always sensed that maybe that it was that it's overstated, that there's a protested too much piece to that. West Texas is not. Yes, it can be very poor, but it's not. It's not Boone County, West Virginia either. So I don't know. What bugs me though is the phoniness of it all. I think there's something about that. It always bugged me about George Will. When someone can't make an honest presentation for themselves, I always suspect that they're somehow up to something. They have an agenda. And
with Will, this idea that we learn when he's quite an old man that, he'd abandoned religion years ago. And, you're keeping this to yourself there. Are you, George? Well, you're teaching us about conservatism and everything that means. The fact that you are pretty much a stone atheist now, maybe you should have imparted that to your readers.
Well, I know someone who used to sit in the owner's box for the Washington Redskins when Jack Kent Cooke owned the team. And George Will would often be there. And he has long said that George Will is a gold-plated phony. He doesn't believe any of the stuff he writes. It's all an act. You shouldn't accept any of it. And I find that easy to believe, which is a bias on my part. But, well, see, that brings up another subject that's kind of one that sticks in my craw about Buckley conservatism, is how many of them are just pens for hire. Payola
they're selling themselves pretty cheap. Yeah. Considering how many billionaires there are out there now, they are selling themselves cheap.
Well, there's always been a payola problem with these guys. The guy who runs the Federalist, Ben Domenech, I think he pronounced his name. Not sure. He was caught up taking money from the Malaysian government to write, to weave wonderful things about Malaysia into his column at the time. And, the guy who, what was his name? Casey, what the heck is his name? He's the guy who's bankrolling Mark Levin's internet TV operation.
I know who you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, he stroked a check to Ben Shapiro. I think it's Ben Shapiro. The Wilkes brothers were out financing these guys. And of course, I've always suspected that Williamson, of course, being from Texas, and the Wilkes brothers being from Texas, and Ted Cruz being from Texas, his over-the-top anti-Trump, these unhinged columns that he was writing, were exactly that. It was just payola.
Well, I see that, Williamson was associated with the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS, as they ironically call it at George Mason University. I know a little bit about the Institute for Humane Studies, and George Mason University seems to me to be the center of intellectual evil in the United States.
Well, it's this, they took Frank Meyer fusionism and then sliced off the old traditional conservatism. So basically it's just libertarianism tarted up with some conservative language.
No, but I mean, just what I know about IHS is that you wonder who gets these fellowships and gets invited to these programs or whatever. And the level that these decisions, the extent to which these decisions are based on personal prejudice or just spite. I was rather shocked to find this out. But there's one last thing I have to ask you before we go, and it seems kind of dutiful, but I'm going to press ahead. Regardless, the question is, how black-pilled are you regarding Donald Trump, if at all? Well,
I did my last post was on the fact that you can't judge Trump by conventional metrics. I've dealt with guys like him. You see them a lot in the construction business, in large projects, things like that. Housing tracts. It's a tough business, and you've got to be exceedingly shrewd in how you manipulate people because every deal, its profit is in the initial transaction. When you go to build a housing project somewhere, you make all your money in how you bought the land. That's where all the money's made. All the other stuff, that's all baked in the cake. And so these guys they put all their energy into the negotiating side, into the distraction side, keeping people from noticing what they're up to, because that's a big part of being successful, is concealing where the money is to be made. And so that's all that blather from Trump. It's his nature. He does this every day of his life. That's who he is. But that's not a politician. Our politicians have always been different. So he's an extreme outlier. He, I think, is not an ideologue. He's extremely pragmatic. I suspect to some degree that this Syrian business, his calculation was it'll shut up the guys like McCain and Graham. It'll get the Russian thing off the newspapers. And what the hell? It only costs $100 million. It's fun to launch a few missiles. And we'll see what happens. I think that's maybe as far as he went with his thinking. He's just not an ideological guy. He's not that kind of a thinker. So,
yeah, but we have this. Sorry to interrupt, but we have this business where Bannon is in trouble. I mean, yes. Trump gave him the back of the hand to the New York Post, and we have these people like Tillerson and Nikki Haley, the ambassador with the porn star name, who are talking up regime change in a big way. So on the one hand, Bannon is supposed to be in trouble because he's not a team player. But Tillerson and Haley, they don't seem to be in trouble for all their talk of regime change.
Yeah, I would. My guess is that Bannon's in trouble because he doesn't get along with Trump's kids. Trump's a funny dude. I think people probably have figured out that the two ways you can get to him is appeal to his family. In other words, do this because it's what your kids would like, or your family would like, or his sort of base sort of instincts. And I think probably Trump's kids don't like Bannon, who, from what I understand, is kind of a prickly sort. He's not someone who you like instantly. But I guess my view of Trump has always been, and I've written this before, that I call him the destroyer of worlds. He's the mule. He's not supposed to exist in the political environment that we've had for the last quarter century. And his existence, his winning, is causing the old political structure to creak and crack and just not hold. It's losing its internal coherence. The best we get out of Trump is flipping over some tables, kicking down some doors, and making a general mess of things so that we have to start over, or at least forces reform. I think that's the best we can ever get out of Trump.
I see this story in the Washington Post today about Bannon being on the outs. It says, in the White House, Bannon went to war with the business leaders Kushner helped recruit to the administration. Cohn, that's Gary Cohn, formerly of Goldman Sachs, and others, including Dina Powell, the senior economic counselor and deputy national security advisor. Bannon privately derided them as globalists and Democrats, officials said, even though Powell worked in George W. Bush's administration and has been called a principled conservative by leading Republican senators. I read that and I laughed and I thought, and then I was sad and I thought, haven't we moved on for that? Doesn't everyone know that principled conservative means a globalist sellout? Someone who would trade in his grandmother for a better parking space? It is
a funny thing. And there's, to some degree, we on the dissident right have to be cautious, but we live in two worlds now. These people writing these Washington Post articles, National Review jettisoned their comment section so they wouldn't have to read complaints from people like me. They're shutting up the windows and doors so they don't hear the noise outside, and that allows them to imagine it's not out there. So they say these things, and the people outside are looking at each other like just as you just said, my Lord, where have these people been? The word principled conservative has been a joke for 2 years. It's a Twitter gag, for goodness sakes. And it's an old Twitter gag. You look like a geezer if you start running the principled conservative line, And it's kind of like the DR3 line. It
reminds me of the joke Voinovich, the Russian writer. I may not be pronouncing his name correctly. This idea that, when the communists in the Soviet Union, the idea that they had Karl Marx, they were holding him by the beard with one hand, and they were looking through Das Kapital with the other and saying, well. And this idea that these principled conservatives, I don't know, they've got Edmund Burke on one hand and de Tocqueville in the other. It's preposterous.
Oh, yeah. I saw Brit Hume on Fox News on television after Trump had sealed the nomination. And he said with a straight face that for as long as anyone has ever known, since Edmund Burke, conservatism has been about lowering taxes, open trade, and an aggressive foreign policy. I almost fell out of my chair. I thought, my goodness, a fully formed adult actually said that on television. And
it's this lack of historical consciousness that John Lukács used to complain about. In the same way that this talk of Sean Spicer that Assad is worse than Hitler. That Hitler, who was this Hitler fellow anyway? Hey, did you know that Hitler was German? Hey, do you know that Hitler was in the Second World War? Like, okay, so what were the First and the Third World Wars about then? Yeah,
it's an interesting thing in the modern age in that we don't have a linear timeline that's based in physics. We have a timeline that's an emotional timeline. For liberals, 1968 was yesterday. It just happened yesterday. It counts so much in their worldview. But 1958, might as well be 1,000 years ago. That's ancient history. Who knows? And who can remember back that far? But conservatives have the same thing. They have this Reagan mystery cult. They assign everything they like. Well, Reagan liked that. Everything they don't like was, well, Reagan didn't like that. I've had people comment to me that that call me a liberal because I'm not enthusiastic about another war in the Middle East.
But Americans are not enthusiastic. George Herbert Walker Bush lost to Bill Clinton in 1992 after a rather short and sharp war, which America won. And then George W. Bush barely beat John Kerry, a deeply flawed candidate, in 2004 after successfully invading Iraq. Things looked pretty good, back then. It just seemed to me that the American appetite for this sort of thing is exhausted.
Yeah, and I point out to this person, I said, well, you realize that Reagan, after the Marine barracks in Lebanon was bombed, made very clear that we had no business being in this part of the world. It was,
and the neocons never forgave him for that.
Yeah. And and I said this to this person, they looked at me like I had just started speaking in tongues. It couldn't be true.
Reagan was also negotiating with Gorbachev, which the neocons considered pretty much to be treason.
Yeah, that's. I have to say, most of the world is fairly understandable, in that when I say understandable, the human condition is immutable. We're not that complicated. We are talking meat sticks, but the neocons are a baffling breed because if they got everything they wanted, it's the worst possible result for Jews in America. It's almost like a suicide cult.
Well, I have come to that very conclusion that it is both a mystery religion. It is a mystery religion, and the nature of that mystery is that it is a death cult.
It really is the only plausible explanation because, what you do not want. I have a fair number of Arab friends. And they will tell you do not want to invite the Arab world to your neighborhood. And, they're well aware of the realities of this. And, you can understand Europe, who chase all their Jews out for the most part. Okay, I get that. They're thinking, they have a different sort of mental framework there. Maybe it's guilt. We chased off the Semites, so let's go get these replacement Semites. I don't know. I mean, it's crazy, but you can kind of noodle through some strange explanation that maybe makes some sense. But in America, which has been an absolute fabulous experience for Jews in the Western world, the Forward magazine, which I don't know if you've ever read it, but the website, they talk about this, that the 20th century was a Jewish century, that this small number of people have had this outlandish influence on Western affairs, and almost exclusively because in America we don't have anti-Semitism. Why on God's green earth are you going to invite millions of people who are raging Jew haters into the country? I mean, it's the craziest thing. I for the life of me, I can't come up with an answer for that.
Well, Edgar Allan Poe, who I mentioned earlier, the imp of the perverse, there's that. But I have long argued that boredom has been always underestimated as a motivator of human conduct.
That's very true. And, we can see that in ourselves. If all the time, especially when we're younger people, the times that we've gotten in trouble is largely because, the idle hands do the devil's work. And that's true. We're a leisure society, and we have that end of history ennui. So perhaps that's part of it.
Well, Zed Blogger, thank you so much. It's been a delightful conversation.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I'll look forward to listening to myself when you have the interview posted.
That concludes our show for this week, Kevin Michael Grace's interview with the Z-Blogger. I'm Kevin Steele. Episode 78 of Grace and Steele was sponsored by Pepe Reads, an alt-right patriotic book club which will meet monthly in downtown Vancouver. Those interested in taking part are invited to contact the organizer at pepereads@protonmail.com. Thanks for listening.